Thank you all. It's a great pleasure to be here today in this absolutely gorgeous building and have the chance to talk to you about the MacArthur Network on Housing and Families with Children that I have the pleasure and honor to direct. You might think of us, in a sense, as the longer-term academic research arm of the Foundation's efforts to see how housing matters. And we are the academic arm, and we're a little bit blue sky in some ways, so be warned in advance. I have to, I guess, mention first, what is a research network? As MacArthur does them, they're groups of about 10, 12 established scholars, we are 11, who do research together for 6 or 7 years on a broad topic. These scholars come from different disciplinary fields, and our group of 11 includes economists, sociologists, psychologists, people with public health backgrounds, statisticians, public policy. And this group differs not just in disciplinary background, but also in the extent to which we are housers, as I've learned to say. About a third of the people have staked their primary professional reputation around housing research, but almost 2/3 of them have had a hand in housing research, but it's never been their primary academic identity. And that means that we are able to have very vigorous, challenging debates among ourselves, and we include people who do not share the assumptions of the past of the field. Now, it takes time to get to know each other's disciplinary languages, to learn to trust and like each other, and that task is by now over in this particular network. The job of a network is to design a research agenda that's supposed to be superior to anything that could be done from a single disciplinary perspective. And the design of that research agenda has been largely done, though just 10 minutes ago, Greg Duncan and I were revising some parts of it. And after the research agenda is designed, then there's a job of getting all the logistics in place, and then there's the job of actually doing the research, and we anticipate being in the field with our large study in late 2012, reporting back in 2016. The members of this network are 5 of them here, actually, today I've seen. Dolores Acevedo Garcia, Sandy Newman, the omnipresent Jeff Lubell, Jens Ludwig, Greg Duncan, and not here today, haven't seen, are Tamar Leventhal from Tufts, Sibel Raver from NYU, Kathy Eden from Harvard, Mary Patillo from Northwestern, and Steve Raudenbush from the University of Chicago. Now, what's our mandate? Well, I had discussions with people at the Foundation, the former president, Mike, Erica, a few years back, and I think the mandate reflects several important things. The first thing is that evidence matters for policy and for the theory that develops about housing's effects. It's also that certain kinds of evidence may particularly matter. There are many kinds of evidence that are relevant, but the evidence generated by scholarly bodies that gets published in first-rate outlets gives a particular credibility in the policy world and in the academic world. And that is what we were invoked to search for. So evidence matters, but some kinds of evidence may particularly matter for some important audiences. The second thing that came out in setting up a network was this sense of how important the research has been on early childhood interventions and how many of them have affected adult life course in the sense of leading to graduations from high school and college, stable partnering relationships in the family, better employment, and less involvement with the criminal justice system including incarceration. And the former president of the foundation was very high on this literature, in part because of its scholarly qualities and because there's obvious cost benefits to these early childhood interventions in later life. And the question is, does housing have a role to play in the way young children are brought up that affect these later life chances? Now, within this broad mandate, we were left free to design our own research agenda with only these constraints of a timeline of 6 or 7 years and a constraint of a certain amount, generous amount of money, which turns out to be not enough for what we want to do. And so we're out there trying to raise more funds. So what does the network want to do? The first thing I want to mention is a little bit incidental, because it's not a study, but we think it's non-trivial. There are not very many in the housing literature well-validated causal effects of housing. And we have the sense that we need more of those and faster. And we're going to address this incidental aim, not a central aim, this incidental aim mostly through the findings we generate about how housing affects families and children. And that's the main one. We also want to approach this aim through the development of newer methods for being able to draw causal conclusions from research that is not experimental. We want to do it by bringing people into the network who are not housing scholars, but may well become so for the future to build up the sort of the cadre of housing researchers. And we're doing this by the people we brought into the network. We have network associates, some of whom are experts on children, neighborhoods, schools, rather than housing. And we have our own graduate students and postdocs we're involving in this research who might have studied other things, but in the future may well study housing. So we're trying to make a very modest increase in the number, the disciplinary mix, and the age structure of future housing researchers. But our main goals are the following. We're going to do a single large study that has a survey with random selection of households in 4 cities built into it, plus an experimental study of vouchers. And this single study has a number of aims, and I want to just outline briefly in the short time available to me 3 of them, 2 of which are pretty fixed, 1 of which is in flux. The network assumes that we don't yet understand well how poorer families make their housing decisions given the financial constraints under which they suffer. So we want to learn more about how they conceptualize, frame the housing decisions in their life, where they get information about these decisions from, and particularly, what are the consequences for children's development of how they make these decisions? Let me give you one example. There's clear trade-offs to be made between the size of the unit you live in, if you're poor, and the quality of the neighborhood and schools to which you have access. If you want, for whatever reasons, a larger unit, then you're more likely to finish up in a lower quality, let's call it neighborhood, with access to lower quality preschools and schools. If you want, on the other hand, to maximize the quality of schools for your children, then for the constrained budget you suffer under, you are likely to live in a smaller unit, given that rents vary with the quality of neighborhoods. So this is a dilemma for families, and we want to understand, using qualitative and quantitative methods, how this is framed and worked through by families, both ordinarily and also when they're confronted with getting a voucher, because the voucher forces them to make these decisions about how to use it in a way that is really concrete and not abstract in real time. So why is this important? And then, of course, we want to study the effects of the choices that people make, how they resolve these trade-offs. So why is this important? Well, the risk of sounding presumptuous, there's been quite a bit of housing policy in the past, and many demonstrations from scholars that have made strong assumptions about the preferences, capacities of families when they are given options. And in many studies, there's been take-up rates that were disappointingly small than you would have anticipated. If we want policy to be able to come up with options that people can and will use, then we have to know more about how families make these decisions, make these trade-offs in their lives. The second aim follows from the assumption we have that housing does have some direct effects, but most of its effects, or many of its effects, are going to be mediated through how the housing as bricks and mortar affects family functioning and how it affects the quality of neighborhoods and schools. So the total effects of housing are direct and indirect through the mechanisms of family, neighborhoods, and schools. And unless you've captured all of this, you're under-capturing the effects of housing. So we are going to do an experimental study of voucher winners in 4 cities and contrasting them with non-winners. And we're going to do this with the general population of voucher-eligible families, not those who are in public housing, as was the case with MTO, because in the general eligible population, when they get a voucher, have to blend 3 things. One is they can improve the quality of their housing, right, in a neighborhood something like the one they're already in, or they can purchase a better neighborhood, or they can convert the voucher into disposable income by offsetting the rent that they already pay. Now, there's scholarly literature which indicates that each of these 3 mechanisms, better housing, better neighborhoods, and especially higher disposable income, translate into better health. It translates into reduced stress. It translates into less anxiety, depression for mothers, and even depression for kids. It translates into less asthma and other things, and of course the obesity and diabetes we heard about today. And there's also indications that these effects can be biologically detected. So we're going to collect saliva to look at cortisol and dried blood to look at certain inflammatory processes that happen, interleukin-6 and C-reactive protein, in order to be able to see whether housing, getting the voucher and these changes it means in income, housing, and neighborhoods, translates not just into better health, but also into improved biological functioning, under the assumption that if you can show it affects the biological processes that are highly correlated with a lot of later health outcomes, particularly cardiovascular ones, then policy will pay special attention to housing and its links to schools and neighborhoods as that affects biology and health. The third aim is the one that's not as fixed as the other 2, and it is to study how housing affects children's self-regulation, and through that, a variety of cognitive school outcomes and some social behavioral outcomes, because the early childhood literature shows these effects, study after study after study, not all, but most studies, show these effects on early adult outcomes. And we know they're not mediated through children getting higher test scores, because the test score gains they get the early years fade out in all these studies. So the mystery is, why is it that children do better in early adulthood, in adulthood, from these early interventions? No one knows the answer. One speculation is around the importance of self-regulation processes, the ability to control your emotions, to control speaking out, to take turns in order. All these kinds of interpersonal bonding processes that allow people to accept you may be, and this is speculation, one of the mechanisms that leads to these things. So we're going to look at how noise, crowding, and such things affects children's self-regulation, how certain school processes, preschool processes may affect children's self-regulation, and hopefully also neighborhood processes affects children's self-regulation, and there is evidence that such self-regulation is related to these later outcomes. It's all correlational. So how are we going to do these things? Well, we have one study to take place in 4 cities. We have talked to the authorities in these cities, and they are more than willing to help us with all the information we need. The 4 cities are Cleveland and its 10 immediately adjacent towns and cities within Cuyahoga County, Dallas, Denver, and Seattle. Within each of these places, we will study 2 populations. One population, as I've mentioned, is voucher winners and non-winners. And the second population is a random sample of the people living in those cities whose household income is below the area median income. So we will have this sort of representative population sample of the bottom half of the income distribution plus the voucher sample. And the voucher is very important because it's central to the health aim, health and biology aim. It's the place where this trade-off takes place. Families are facing, what do we do with the money? And it can serve as, technically speaking, an instrumental variable strategy for looking at causal effects in the rest of the population. We're going to do interviews with the main caregiver of these children, and then that last about 2 hours, and then tests with the children that last about 2 hours. We're going to do that in 3 waves of data, about 18 months apart, over 3 years. We are also going to link these data to administrative data sources from school districts and from the census. And we'll do, as I mentioned before, qualitative data collection. In total, across the 4 cities, we'll have about 2,700 adults and 3,750 children. And so that's very roughly sketched what we propose to do. So where are we now? Well, we are a network, and we're functioning like a network. And this is hard to do because the people in this network are all heavily overcommitted people. So for them to make extra time is something that's very special, and it's very hard to do. And so what we do, and we meet 4 times a year on a regular basis, and we have sort of subgroups working in between. We have planned most of the research agenda, though not all of it. We're now working on the first stages of this agenda, that we're talking to public housing authorities. We're talking to a survey data collection agency. We are trying to raise more money than is needed, even after MacArthur's generous contribution. We have no data yet. We should have this again in 5 years, and then we will give you the results. And if you want to, and we follow these children up into early adulthood, then I'll see you again in 20 years. So that's about what we're trying to do. Do we have time for questions, or? No, not really, no? Well, thank you very much for your patience in listening to me. Thank you.